Welcome to Paskvan Podcasts. Please like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps this channel. Tonight, we are turning our attention to the one secret the sea has just refused to swallow, the eternal wandering mystery of the phantom sailor. Before we had satellites and radar, before that whole safety net of modern navigation, the ocean wasn't just, an empty space of water.
No, not at all. It was an active, breathing, colossal realm, a place of profound terror.
Right, where every wave felt like it was carrying some kind of judgment. Fate out there wasn't just something that happened to you. It felt like it was being aggressively enforced.
And that sense of the ocean wielding absolute authority, that is the crucible where this whole myth was forged. The fear was justified, really, because the consequences were immediate and often total.
And that's the perfect backdrop for the most famous phantom in maritime history, the Flying Dutchman.
A vessel that's always sailing against the wind, crewed by the damned.
Never finding rest, never making port. For centuries, just the sight of this ship was considered the ultimate bad omen.
It was a harbinger that your doom was sealed, a sign that the universe had finally completely turned against you in your journey.
It didn't matter if it was glimpsed through the foam of a tempest or on waters that were eerily calm. The psychological message it sent to the crew was just terrifyingly concise.
Also, you were already lost to the world.
Yeah.
So our purpose here is to trace the complete historical and psychological trajectory of this horrifying legend. We're going to look at the centuries of reported sightings, many recorded by respected naval officers.
And then get into the scientific explanations that try to lift that veil of illusion.
Exactly. And crucially, we have to understand why this story, which deals with these themes of eternal punishment and isolation, has so staunchly refused to sink into oblivion, even when faced with the hard logic of the modern world.
So I think we have to approach this by asking the core question. How does a whisper pass between a few exhausted, frightened sailors in some faraway port? How does that become a universal certainty?
A certainty shared across all global maritime cultures.
And why does a symbol of such ancient elemental fear still hold so much power over our rational 21st century imagination? We need to fully unpack this journey from folklore to global metaphor.
To really feel the chilling power the Flying Dutchman had over the minds of sailors, you have to place yourself right in the middle of that brutal, unforgiving reality of seafaring life.
We're talking about the 17th and 18th centuries here.
Yes, the Age of Sail. This was an era defined by global ambition, where the expansion of empires and the very foundation of international trade relied completely on this unpredictable combination.
Wooden ships, canvas sails.
And the sheer, raw human endurance of the crews.
And when we talk about voyages during this time, we aren't talking about a few weeks at sea, are we?
Oh, no. These were expeditions that lasted for months, often stretching into multiple years.
Living in these cramped, damp, unsanitary conditions.
Awful conditions, and often without even seeing land for these agonizingly long periods. The sheer reliance on the integrity of a wooden hull and the willpower of a few hundred men to survive was truly staggering.
The infrastructure just wasn't there to support them. They were completely alone.
And that isolation meant that the crews faced relentless, continuous threats, every single watch. It wasn't just the obvious danger of the weather.
No.
Starvation was a constant companion. Rations were meager. Food spoiled so quickly. Disease was rampant. Scurvy, typhus, infections. They spread like wildfire.
A simple illness could decimate a crew far faster than any storm.
It could. And the elements, of course, were the primary enemy. Storms could rage for days, just tearing rigging apart, snapping masts. Imagine the terror for the men below deck.
But even without a storm, danger was constant. Navigation was, it was rudimentary and deeply challenging.
They were relying so heavily on these imperfect, often century-old charts and a technique called dead reckoning.
Which is basically a calculated guess, right?
It's an estimation of their position based on their direction and speed since the last time they knew where they were.
So it's a calculation vulnerable to every unseen current, every unrecorded gust of wind.
Exactly. They used celestial navigation, too, observing the stars and sun. But even that was at the mercy of cloud cover and just the sheer difficulty of taking accurate timings on a constantly pitching deck.
The margin for error here was, non-existent. We're talking about this massive reliance on tiny, imperfect measurements.
A single navigational miscalculation, a simple error in judgment about currents or weather. It could doom the entire ship and everyone on it.
And that inherent, ever-present vulnerability, that knowledge that your fate hung on a fraying rope or a cloudy sky, that's the fundamental contest we have to remember.
This vulnerability created an environment where pure, hard logic often just failed them, because logic couldn't stop typhus or predict a rogue wave.
Which naturally leads us to the role of superstition. In the Age of Sail, superstition flourished. And it wasn't born out of ignorance, was it?
Not at all. It wasn't about a lack of intellect. It was born from a profound psychological and practical necessity.
The sea gave these men every possible reason to believe that unseen, unpredictable forces were actively at work.
Because the consequences of those forces, shipwreck, disease, vanishing, were so deadly and so immediate, the environment demanded a psychological framework that could cope with that overwhelming uncertainty.
So every experienced sailor had this, a complex mental catalog of omens and signs and taboos.
Yes, and they weren't just quaint traditions. They were signals, warning systems, that the fragile relationship they had with the natural world might be turning violently against them.
Let's get into some of the specific examples of these omens from the sources. They really do illustrate how paper-thin that line was between a natural event and a supernatural warning.
We can start with the simple visual ones. A red sunrise that was often interpreted not just as a weather pattern, but as suggesting, impending conflict on the horizon, a sign of coming violence.
And then the atmospheric changes. A sudden, inexplicable calm. A stillness in the air.
For a sailor, that wasn't peace. That was dread. A dead calm was often the precursor to a sudden, devastating squall or a huge storm that would hit without any warning.
The taboos about what people could do are even more telling, I think, about their psychological landscape.
Absolutely. Think about just the simple act of whistling on deck. That was often strictly forbidden.
Why?
It was seen as a direct, arrogant challenge to the wind itself, an attempt to summon the wind that could potentially call upon too much power, causing a lethal storm.
So they felt they were in this constant negotiation with the elements.
Constantly. Even a seemingly benign event, like a seabird landing in the rigging, could be viewed as a sign of fate, or a lost soul intervening, disrupting the natural order. Their world was constantly delivering signals, and interpreting those signals quickly was essential for survival.
So that blurring of the natural and the supernatural was just constant. They lived in a reality where the weather itself was a form of communication from higher powers.
And this sustained psychological tension, this constant threat of the unknown, it prepared the cultural ground for the specific legend of the Dutchman to finally take shape.
That's the key precondition, then.
It is. Before the Dutchman gained its specific, terrible name, generalized folklore about phantom ships was already widespread. In every port across the globe.
Sailors would claim to have seen these abandoned vessels just drifting for weeks, sails taut, apparently moving with purpose, but with no living crew on deck.
And those derelict ships were profoundly unsettling.
But the more terrifying sightings were the ones that just defied physical reality. Vessels that glowed eerily at night were ships seen sailing straight into inescapable storms.
Storms that no sane living captain would ever consider entering.
Right.
And these accounts weren't just isolated incidents dismissed as drink-fueled tales. They were shared and amplified from port to port, and with each retelling, the details got embroidered, making the stories more vivid, more consistent, and, more credible.
So the maritime world was already primed to accept the concept of vessels trapped eternally between realms.
Exactly. Ships that were neither safely making port nor properly wrecked and sunk. This idea of eternal, purposeless wandering was already deeply embedded in the culture. It was just awaiting the right figurehead, the right monumental tragedy, to give it its final, horrifying form.
So when we look at the specific geographical origin of the Flying Dutchman, it's not just about geography, is it? It's about the wealth and the vulnerabilities of an empire.
The Dutch Maritime Empire, specifically. The earliest versions of this legend start to appear in folklore around the late 17th century, and they're intrinsically linked to the huge logistical demands of Dutch global trade.
The Dutch East India Company was, for all intents and purposes, the largest corporation the world had ever seen.
It was immense. It was responsible for sending massive fleets of heavily laden merchant ships all across the globe. Their vessels were the absolute backbone of commerce.
Especially the ones attempting that essential but catastrophically perilous route around the southern tip of Africa.
The notorious Cape of Good Hope.
It wasn't just a difficult passage. It was almost an existential test for any vessel or captain trying to reach the East Indies.
It earned its chilling nickname, the Cape of Storms, honestly. It's notoriously unpredictable, largely because of the unique way that two major ocean currents collide right there.
And that collision of currents is crucial.
Yeah.
Can you describe the specific hazard that made that region such a graveyard for ships?
You have the warm, southward-flowing Agulhas current meeting the icy, northward-flowing Benguela current, which comes up from near the Antarctic.
Okay.
When these massive bodies of water clash, they generate incredibly turbulent conditions. You get these violent, swirling storms and sudden squalls that can whip up almost instantly without any atmospheric warning.
And this is where you get those rogue waves, too.
Exactly. Massive walls of water that seem to come out of nowhere, capable of crushing even the sturdiest vessel. So many ships just vanished there without a trace. No survivors, often no wreckage. It naturally became the perfect, terrifying origin point for a legend of eternal cursed doom.
And this geographical terror brings us right to the heart of the story. The captain's act of defiance. The most enduring versions of the legend always center on a single, fateful decision made by the captain during one of these violent storms near the Cape.
A captain most commonly named Hendrik van der Decken.
And the nature of his defiance wasn't just about trying to sail through the storm, it was more than that.
It was an ultimate, almost cosmic refusal to yield. To the natural order, to common sense. He faced a colossal storm, and instead of taking shelter or admitting defeat, he famously swore that he would round the Cape.
Even if it took him until the day of judgment to do it.
Yes. A vow of unyielding human arrogance.
That hubris is the defining choice. That's what attracts the curse. In the most dramatic tellings, it wasn't just a promise to himself or his terrified crew.
No, it escalated into a direct, arrogant challenge hurled against powers far beyond his control. A specific curse against God, or perhaps blasphemy against the elemental forces of the sea itself. His ambition was the catalyst for his eternal damnation.
And the punishment that follows is just perfectly tailored to the transgression.
Perfectly. The ship and every soul on board were condemned to sail the oceans forever, never able to make port, never able to find the release of death, rest, or proper burial.
That's the profound, ultimate irony of the curse, isn't it? He sought to conquer the voyage.
And in return, he was bound to it for all eternity.
The sources are chillingly specific about the conditions of this entrapment, too. They emphasize this profound denial of basic human peace.
It's not that the crew simply runs out of food and water. That would be a quick end. Instead, their supplies would rot, rendering them useless, while the crew themselves would age and suffer, but never be allowed to escape the vessel through death.
It's the ultimate sailing prison, a vessel permanently trapped in a state of suspended animation.
The concept is psychologically brilliant. It prevents that final, comforting release that death usually offers. The ship becomes a definitive, visible warning to the living. This is the inevitable consequence when human ambition is taken too far.
But we should also talk about the alternative accounts of the origin, because they layered in a moral structure that really resonated with the common sailor.
That's a critical point. The curse wasn't always attributed solely to arrogance during a storm. Some widely circulated versions claim the captain had committed unspeakable acts beforehand.
Like what?
Piracy, maybe involvement in the horrific slave trade, or a morally devastating transgression. Refusing to aid another ship that was clearly in distress and signaling for help during that same storm.
And why was refusing aid considered such a profound moral failing?
Because the sea was a communal, high-risk environment. The unwritten law of the sea mandated mutual aid. To see a fellow sailor in distress and deliberately withhold assistance was seen as a betrayal of the entire maritime community.
It placed self-interest and profit above human life.
By including these severe moral failings, the legend gained immense psychological weight. It established a clear, understandable moral framework. It suggested that the sea itself was acting as an instrument of divine retribution, enforcing a necessary cosmic balance.
Just imagine the impact this terrifying story had on the actual sailors hearing it below deck. They faced the constant, terrifying prospect of dying at sea without a proper burial, their bodies just claimed by the ocean forever.
And the idea of an eternal sailing prison full of the dead, still moving, still conscious, still suffering, this resonated deeply with their most profound daily fears.
The legend offered a tangible, visible form to their dread.
It was utterly plausible to them that the souls of drowned, unrepentant sailors would be bound forever to the very wooden vessels that had betrayed their trust. The story survived and gained global traction not just because it was a captivating tale, but because it perfectly articulated a horror, the lack of an ending, that they experienced on an emotional level every single day.
And so the Flying Dutchman moves beyond just folklore and becomes cemented in the global maritime consciousness because of the really unsettling consistency of the reported sightings.
These reports span centuries, and they crossed oceans, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, deep into the Pacific. Sailors swore they saw it, not that they imagined it.
An unnatural silhouette etched against the clouds or glowing faintly in the night.
And the lasting credibility of the legend really hinges on the specific, consistent, physical description of this apparition. These weren't novices. These were experienced navigators and crewmen.
Men who knew ships and seas intimately.
And yet they described seeing something that was utterly impossible by the known laws of physics.
The description of the ship's luminosity is often the key thing, isn't it?
It is. Witnesses consistently reported the sails as being faintly luminous, glowing either an unnatural white or a pale green against the darkness, almost as if the light source was deep within the cursed vessel itself.
But the hull was always dark, weather-beaten, sometimes scorched, but still unnaturally intact for its age.
And then you analyze the reports of its movement. Witnesses consistently reported the ship performing nautical feats that just defied basic physics.
Like sailing directly into the teeth of the wind.
An impossibility for a square-rigged vessel. Or maintaining perfect, unnatural stability while cutting through truly violent, heavy seas without the expected pitching or rolling.
Some of the most dramatic reports even claimed it hovered just slightly above the surface of the water.
Yes, casting no discernible weight, before vanishing as quickly as it appeared, as if swallowed by a sudden mist.
And the sightings of the crew that added the final, terrible layer of dread to these reports.
Figures were often seen clearly on deck or climbing the rigging lines, just standing silent and completely unmoving at the rail. They were observed, but they were unresponsive to any signals, to any calls, clearly separated from the realm of the living.
These accounts weren't just rumors in taverns. They started appearing in official documents. Ship logs, captain's journals, newspaper accounts.
Tracing back as far as the late 17th century, and the sheer fact that these highly specific, impossible details aligned across crews, separated by vast distances and time, often without any direct communication, that's what transformed these isolated reports into an accepted global legend.
The most famous, most cited, and most historically verifiable encounter is the one from 1881. The one that solidified the ship's reputation as an active omen that delivered doom, not just predicted it.
That is the pivotal account. It involves Prince George of Wales, who was serving at the time as a midshipman aboard the British naval vessel HMS Bacchante.
And they were sailing near Australia.
They were. According to the detailed accounts recorded in the ship's official journal, which was later published, the apparition appeared just after 4 a.m. A distinct, glowing ship materialized ahead of them, illuminated by this very strange, deep red light.
And the description was unmistakable, visible to the officer of the watch and several other crew members.
And the terror of the sighting was almost immediately reinforced by a tragedy that followed. This ensured it was remembered not just as a strange visual event, but as an intervention of fate.
Right.
Precisely. The ship's log recorded that only a few hours after the sighting, at 10:45 that very morning, the able seaman who had officially reported the sighting fell tragically to his death from the fore topmast rigging. This swift, brutal incident transformed the narrative. The Flying Dutchman was now perceived by many sailors not just as passively predicting disaster, but actively marking the individual or the ship whose doom was imminent and unavoidable. It ceased being a myth and became a documented, lethal reality within the naval consciousness.
So, given the lack of instant communication back then, how did these highly specific stories travel so fast and gain such widespread acceptance across different navies and merchant fleets?
Ports. Ports were the absolute critical social and informational hubs of the sailing world. When ships arrived, crews from dozens of different vessels, British, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, would converge in the same establishments, sharing rumors, stories, warnings.
So if one crew saw a strange glowing ship, that might be dismissed.
It might be. But if a second crew, weeks later and thousands of miles away, claimed to have seen the identical spectral vessel with the identical unnatural glow and silent crew, then a terrifying, undeniable pattern emerged.
The alignment of specific details was the proof.
And the shared name, the Flying Dutchman, was attached permanently.
This speaks volumes about the psychological process involved. Fear in that isolated environment, it must have sharpened the memory.
Every retelling would emphasize the most frightening, impossible elements. The lack of a wake sailing into the wind, and the isolation at sea amplified this belief exponentially.
When you're surrounded by nothing but sky and water for months, the stories you share take on enormous life and death weight.
There's no outside authority, no newspaper, no land-based scholar to definitively dismiss them. The ship becomes your entire universe, and in that universe, omens are the only form of advanced warning you might receive.
The shared belief became the basis for plausibility.
It did. Sailors knew instinctively that ships vanished without explanation every single year. They understood that death was an ever-present deckhand. The idea that a ship could be trapped eternally between worlds felt perhaps less absurd than the alternative.
Which was that death and loss were just completely random, meaningless, and arbitrary.
Exactly. The legend of the Dutchman offered structure to that elemental fear. It provided a narrative, a moral explanation, a reason for the sea's ultimate and often random cruelty.
So by the turn of the 19th century, the legend is so deeply embedded that skeptics and early scientists start asking the critical question.
Right. How can we explain centuries of reported sightings by generally reliable, experienced observers without having to resort to purely supernatural explanations? This marks that crucial shift towards scientific inquiry, trying to replace the myth's meaning with optical mechanics.
The scientific challenge is vital because it doesn't just dismiss the sightings as pure invention. It accepts that the observers saw something.
But it fundamentally relocates the cause from a divine curse to a natural phenomenon. But we have to begin, as you mentioned before, by acknowledging the intense human factor under those extreme conditions.
Yes, that often gets overlooked.
Sailors lived under unimaginable, relentless strain. Constant, extreme sleep deprivation from working the watches, sheer physical exhaustion, chronic dehydration, and often systemic illnesses like scurvy.
Which can cause complex hallucinations.
It can. Under these conditions, exposed to the elements, poor sanitation, meager food, the human mind's perception was guaranteed to falter. Hallucinations caused by physiological stress were documented, and the brain, desperate for structure, would often subconsciously fill in the gaps with the terrifying narratives they already knew.
But the really compelling natural explanation for the visual consistency of the sightings points to a very specific type of optical illusion, the Fata Morgana.
The Fata Morgana is a superior mirage, and it is a brilliant piece of atmospheric optics that provides a perfect explanation for many of these historical descriptions of the phantom ship.
So how does it work?
To understand it, we need to talk about temperature inversion. This illusion is caused when a layer of warm, less dense air settles over a layer of cooler, denser air near the ocean's surface. This temperature gradient creates a duct that bends light rays in extremely unusual and profound ways.
So explain the physics of how that light bending makes a distant ship look like a ghost.
Normally, light rays travel straight or curve slightly upwards with the Earth's curvature, but in a superior mirage, that warm air layer acts like a curved lens. It causes the light rays coming from a distant object, a real ship, maybe 30 or 40 miles away, well below the visible horizon, to be bent downwards toward the observer.
So the observer sees the image projected high up in the sky.
High up, yes, and often stretched vertically, inverted, or unnaturally shimmering.
And the features that the sailors reported, the ship hovering above the waves, the impossible luminosity, the distorted shape, that all aligns perfectly with the visual effect of a superior mirage.
Precisely. The ship appears suspended, often looking much closer and unnaturally larger than it is. It might look like it's floating because the actual waterline is hidden by the horizon, and the lower part of the reflected image might be blurred or absent.
And this strange, unnatural glow.
That's because the light is being refracted and intensified through that atmospheric duct. And crucially, the regions most associated with the Dutchman sightings, particularly that volatile area off the Cape of Good Hope, are known hotspots for Fata Morgana.
Because of that extreme collision of cold and warm air masses.
Exactly.
The sources also indicate that other, less dramatic environmental deceptions could have contributed to the phantom's credibility.
Yes, we have to consider the cumulative effect of multiple factors. For instance, dense sea fog can dramatically warp both sound and vision. It can make a ship seem to appear solid and then completely dissolve in moments.
And then there's light refraction from, say, lanterns.
Yes, lantern light, reflecting through heavy mist or sea spray, can produce these intensely eerie halos or colors, giving the ship an unnatural, self-illuminated glow that isn't truly there.
And the phenomenon of bioluminescence, the light created by living organisms in the ocean, that must have also played a role.
Indeed. Massive blooms of phosphorescent plankton, disturbed by a ship's movement, can cause the water itself to shimmer and glow with a ghostly pale green light. This effect could easily give the illusion that a hull or the foam of a wake is lit from below,
Reinforcing the idea that the ship is somehow infused with this strange, unearthly internal light.
The environment was actively conspiring to create the ghost.
So from a purely scientific standpoint, we have these incredibly compelling explanations that account for how the visual illusion happened, how the sailor's eyes could be tricked. But the sources consistently highlight a critical philosophical gap in this purely rational analysis.
And that's the key. The scientific explanation successfully addresses the optics, but it completely fails to explain the why.
Why sailors attach this consistent symbolism of a curse, an omen, eternal damnation, and cosmic justice to that specific site.
They didn't just report seeing a strange ship distorted by light. They reported seeing the cursed ship, the one defined by the unforgivable sin of Vanderdecken.
The power of the legend, then, was that it provided structure to the raw, visceral fear caused by the sight. The appearance of a distorted, unnaturally glowing ship became a known, recognizable narrative of inescapable damnation.
It reinforced the essential moral structures of the maritime world, warning against the specific sins of ambition, blasphemy, and reckless disregard for life. Science explained the mechanics of the illusion, but the myth explained the meaning of the terrifying experience.
It's worth considering one final, more psychological environmental factor, too, that may have fed into this sense of dread: the role of infrasound.
That's a really interesting and often overlooked factor. Infrasound refers to sound waves with frequencies lower than 20 hertz, so they're below the range of normal human hearing.
And massive waves and violent storms generate huge amounts of it.
They do. And while we can't consciously hear it, our inner ear and various organs in the body can perceive it.
What are the documented effects of prolonged exposure to infrasound?
Studies have shown that exposure to these low rumbling frequencies can trigger intense, involuntary psychological reactions. People report feelings of profound dread, deep anxiety, cold chills, and even the sense of an unseen presence nearby.
So if sailors were already exhausted, malnourished, and watching a Fata Morgana appear on the horizon,
the simultaneous perception of infrasound generated by the heavy seas would layer an unavoidable physical feeling of supernatural terror onto the visual deception. The fear, therefore, wasn't just cognitive. It was physically induced by the environment itself.
So the continued survival of the legend is really a triumph of symbolism over empirical evidence.
Absolutely. The legend endured and thrived precisely because it successfully transcended its literal origin as a specific nautical warning. By the time the world entered the industrial and modern ages, it no longer belonged solely to sailors.
It had become a powerful, global metaphor for eternal human suffering, unbridled defiance, and the search for release.
The story moved from being a localized warning about the Cape to reinforcing these essential moral structures against the dangers of reckless, profit-driven ambition. The symbolic weight of the curse just completely overrode the scientific explanations.
And the core narrative remained. The sea functions as a judge and an executioner.
And the ultimate punishment is eternal wandering movement without destination. This fate of ceaseless, purposeless movement was considered fundamentally worse than immediate sinking.
Because it denied the sailor, a man whose life was defined by grueling labor, the comfort of final rest, and the peace of an ending.
And this denial of rest resonated deeply in a world increasingly defined by global trade and continuous backbreaking labor.
The legend's transition from a niche sailor's tale to a global cultural symbol was really cemented by its literary immersion, wasn't it?
It was. We look immediately to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's epic poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Although it doesn't name the Dutchman directly, its narrative echoes the legend so closely that the two became functionally fused in the public imagination.
The story of supernatural punishment following a transgression.
The senseless shooting of the albatross. The mariner is condemned to live and tell his tale, just as Vanderdecken is condemned to sail. The poem reinforces the idea that the ocean is the ultimate moral judge, memory is the torment, and isolation is the ultimate fate.
But the most radical and arguably the most enduring cultural shift came from opera, Richard Wagner's Der Fliegende Holländer.
First performed in 1843, it took the raw horror story and fundamentally transformed its emotional architecture, making it universally relatable.
How did it do that?
Wagner's adaptation was revolutionary because he reframed the curse entirely. He painted the captain not as purely monstrous or damned beyond hope, but as a profoundly tragic, romantic figure, doomed by arrogance, yes, but desperately seeking release from his torment.
And the opera provided a mechanism for that release.
It did. The curse, in Wagner's hands, could be broken not through penance or repentance, but through the fidelity and pure, selfless love of a woman Senta.
This injection of romance, tragedy, and hope into a story that had previously offered only bleak despair was absolutely critical to its cultural longevity.
It meant the Dutchman was no longer just a nautical horror specific to the Cape. It became a powerful, deeply resonant metaphor for universal human suffering, for living with unforgiven guilt, and for profound loneliness without end. It became relatable far beyond the taverns of the Age of Sail.
So the legend continues to adapt and endure today, finding new life in film, games, modern media. Even in its more lighthearted portrayals, the underlying undertone remains consistent, doesn't it?
A journey that never ends, movement that serves no purpose, is a fate far worse than simple death. It has defined the universal image of what a true ghost ship must be: glowing, silent, cursed, and eternally adrift.
So if we synthesize the deepest themes from all these source materials, we can identify 3 core existential anxieties that the Dutchman continues to represent for us today.
Let's start with the first one, the anxiety of guilt and consequence.
This speaks directly to that deeply human fear that our past choices, especially those driven by arrogance or moral failure, lock us into irreversible consequences.
Consequences that can never be escaped, no matter how much time passes or how far we try to sail away from them. Vanderdecken made an unforgivable vow, and he must live with the fallout. It's the fear that something essential was done that simply cannot be undone.
The second core anxiety is isolation. The visual reports emphasize this deeply chilling element. The ship is seen, its crew is visible, but they are utterly unresponsive and unreachable.
They exist close enough to the living world to be recognized, yet they are forever separated by the boundary of the curse.
And this mirrors the most profound and unsettling forms of modern loneliness.
Where technical connection, you can see them, you know they exist, is possible, but meaningful connection is entirely and permanently denied. It's the isolation of being permanently visible, yet eternally separated.
And finally, the third anxiety, the one that ties most closely back to the original transgression: eternal wandering. This idea fundamentally violates our human drive for progress, purpose, and finality.
A ship that sails forever without ever reaching a destination transforms the very freedom of movement into the ultimate imprisonment. This anxiety reflects the fear that our intense, ambitious movement today continues not by joyful choice, but because stopping is functionally impossible.
It's movement utterly devoid of arrival or rest.
In the context of the Age of Sail, an age defined by colonialism and relentless resource extraction, this was the ultimate ironic punishment for boundless ambition. You got the sea, but you got it forever without purpose.
And even today, in a world dominated by satellites and GPS, where we map the ocean floor in unprecedented detail, the story persists. It holds power. Why does the persistence of the unknown still grant this ancient legend such immense relevance?
Because technology, for all its power, has not eliminated all uncertainty or danger. Ships still vanish without warning. Black boxes still fail or are never found. Wreckage is still sometimes completely erased. For all our advanced instruments, the ocean remains capable of humbling technology and reasserting its absolute, mysterious authority.
It reminds us that there are still forces larger than human ingenuity.
The Flying Dutchman ultimately survives not because people actively reject scientific explanations like Fata Morgana, but because science cannot completely satisfy existential fear or the need for meaning.
Knowing how a mirage works doesn't erase that deep, spiritual chill of seeing something impossible on the horizon when you are months from shore.
The legend endures because the debate is no longer about whether the ship physically exists. It's about what the ship represents psychologically. It is a shared, cross-cultural anchor for human guilt, defiance, and restlessness.
Humans are fundamentally drawn to stories without true closure.
A solved mystery fades into history, but an unsolved one lingers eternally in the collective memory, demanding attention. The Flying Dutchman, by the very definition of its curse, offers no resolution, ensuring its endless journey through time and imagination.
It is the definitive warning against human ambition taken too far. Swearing to reach an impossible goal at any cost, defying humility. And that warning, perhaps, is more relevant today than it was in the 17th century.
The legend of the Flying Dutchman thrives precisely because it offers no closure. It is an unsolved mystery that lingers, perpetually just beyond the visible horizon. It reflects those fundamental, deep-seated human anxieties about the inescapable nature of guilt, the chilling reality of isolation, and the dread of restless, eternal labor. These anxieties have remained utterly unchanged for centuries, regardless of how quickly our technology advances or how well we map the ocean. The ship sails on, not just across the sea, but powerfully through human culture, memory, and our collective imagination.
Here's a final thought for you to carry with you. The Flying Dutchman is much more than a ghost ship haunting the waves. It is a profound reflection of human ambition pushed past the point of wisdom, swearing to reach a destination regardless of the cosmic cost. It asks us to consider, as we pursue relentless progress and push the boundaries of what is possible today, whether that is in exploration, artificial intelligence, global finance, or environmental exploitation, what modern endeavor, driven by a similar arrogance and refusal to yield to natural and moral limits, might be inadvertently setting itself up for its own eternal, purposeless journey, forever sailing, and never truly arriving at peace or true success.